Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Monday night going into Tuesday, Yom Shlishi? Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in Missouri, Bella in Florida, John in Maine, Stephen in Dover, New Hampshire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck, Shandora in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Mickey in Vineland, New Jersey, Chaim in Florida, Mark Lister says, all right, and Marjorie Holler in Shalom from Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Also, Belle in Texas. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our very own Yehudit Sobel. In memory of her dear mother, and in Hungarian, Anyuka, a word I know well because I've heard my mother call her mother Anyuka millions of times. And her, Yehudit's Anyuka, was named Miriam Bat Sarah. She left this world very recently. Her Gullus name, as we say, her, non-Jewish name, not her Hebrew name, was Professor Zuzha. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, butchering it. I apologize, Yehudit, but I think it's like Zuzha Shaf Sobel. So may Miriam Bat Sarah's memory always be for a blessing. Yehudit, you're such a great daughter. You really went to great lengths to comfort your mom toward the end of her life. You were there for her. You were amazing. Now you're sponsoring our learning and enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world in the name of your mom. May that lift her even a little higher in her already lofty place in the world of souls. And Yehuda, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings for enabling us to share more Torah, and by doing this mitzvah of supporting Torah study. And we all say Amen. Okay, our daf is page 26 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, 21st volume of the Talmud. And tonight, with God's help, we'll complete chapter 2. Right now, we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 5 in chapter 2, where we were drawing this distinction between the goring ox who does his goring in the public domain versus in the private domain. And we know that an innocuous ox, the owner pays half the damage. A muad, a forewarned ox, an ox with a history of doing damage, the owner pays the full value of the damages, and the injured party has recourse to the superior quality portion of his land, his real property, the owner of the ox's real property. Now we thought, right, Rabbi Tarfon argues, he was overruled by the majority, but Rabbi Tarfon says, if in the case of eating and trampling in the public domain, the owner is exempt, but in the case of goring for the innocuous ox, even in the public domain, the owner has to pay half damages. And then we see that in the private domain, if your ox eats or tramples the property of somebody on their property, then the owner of the ox is liable to pay the full damages. So if the goring ox, whose owner has to pay half damages, even in the public domain, now does the goring in the private domain, you would think he would certainly have to pay the full damages, just as in the case of eating or trampling. That's the kal v'chomer, or a fortiori argument that Rabbi Tarfon made, but the rabbis overruled Rabbi Tarfon and said no, because your kal v'chomer argument, your kal v'chomer inference, is limited by the principle of it is sufficient, meaning what you want to do is extend the half damages from the public domain to the private domain. Okay, so in the case of eating and trampling, where there's no damages and now there's full damages in the private domain, so at the very least we can say that the half damages the innocuous ox's owner pays in the public domain, he also pays in the private domain. But we're not going to say he has to pay full damages in the private domain, because that makes his liability to pay damages for an innocuous ox greater than the source of this law, which is the half damages in the public domain. And that's the argument that won the day, as it were. And yesterday we explored a lot of nuances of how these Kal v'chomer arguments and the limitation, the it is sufficient, that we're not going to extend beyond the source law. It worked in other areas of the law, and now we return to the matter at hand, the goring ox versus the eating and trampling ox. So up to this point, the Gemara discussed how to properly apply the principle, it is sufficient for the conclusion that emerges from a Kal v'chomer inference to be like its source. Now the Gemara returns to discussing the main subject of the Mishnah, which is the various views concerning goring, the primary category of damage. So the Gemara suggests, and let one be held liable for eating and trampling if these take place in the public domain. Right? Why are we exempting eating and trampling in the public domain? Why don't we say, well, just as goring, you pay half damages if it happens in the public domain, so too eating and trampling should pay at least half damages in the public domain. And this can be inferred via a Kal v'chomer inference like this. And if, with regard to damage classified as goring, for which, if it took place on the property of the injured party, according to the rabbis, one is liable to pay only half the cost of the damage, and yet the owner of the animal is nevertheless liable for damage caused in the public domain, then, with regard to damage classified as eating and trampling, whose laws are more strict, as one pays the full cost of the damage when it's caused on the property of the injured party, is it not right? Is it not all the more so that the owner of such an ox should be liable for damage caused in the public domain? And the Gemara rejects this Kal v'chomer. No. Why? The verse states, with regard to eating or trampling, Exodus 22:4, and it, the animal, consumed in the field of another. Meaning that one's liability for this form of damage, now we're talking about eating, is limited to damage caused on the property of the injured party, but not for damage caused in the public domain. The Torah itself makes a sharp distinction between goring, right, where the animal is just acting somewhat atypically, and not just, trying to eat food, which all animals want to do, and not just walking from one place to another, which all animals do, but only some animals are vicious enough to attack in an unprovoked manner, and that's why goring is a separate category, and why goring from an innocuous ox does lead to half damages even in the public domain. But when we're talking about eating and trampling, hey, people left their food lying around where it could get eaten or trampled in the public domain. Why should the owner have to pay? It is a totally different kind of damage with different circumstances. And that's perhaps why, we don't know for sure, but that's perhaps why the Torah made the distinction. Bottom line, the Torah explicitly made a distinction between goring versus eating and trampling. So the Gemara asks, and now we're on page 26a, are we saying that based on the Kal v'chomer inference, one should have to pay the full cost of the damage caused in the public domain for eating and trampling? That would be false, as the verse indicating one's liability to pay the full cost of the damage limits the application to damage caused in the field of another. We are saying only that he should be liable for half the cost of the damage there, just as with regard to goring, right? They're not trying to say that he should pay full damages like he would on the property of another, but at least let him pay half damages in the case of eating or trampling in the public domain, just as we pay half damages for an innocuous ox's goring. But the Gemara rejects this again. This is also incorrect, as the verse states with regard to the payment of half the damage of a goring ox and divide its monetary value. Exodus 21:35. And the use of the expression its monetary value and not the monetary value emphasizes that it is specifically the price of this ox that caused damage, classified as goring, whose money will be divided, i.e. the owner of the ox will be obligated to pay half the cost of the damage, but not the price of another, i.e. not in other cases of damage caused by one's ox. Half damages only applies when we're talking about goring. If we're talking about a different kind of damage, eating or trampling, there's no Torah verse that says half damages for such a thing. Now, the Gemara suggests a derivation from a different inference. And let one be held liable to pay only half the cost of the damage caused by eating and trampling, even if the incident took place on the property of the injured party. Well, why not reverse everything that we've been saying? Why are you so sure that in the case of eating and trampling that happens on the property of the injured party that the owner of the ox has to pay full damages? Why don't we limit that to half damages? And what would be the argument? This can be inferred via a kal vachomer inference drawn from goring, like this. And if for damage classified as goring, which is governed by a stricter law, as one is held liable for damage classified as goring, even if it occurs in the public domain, and yet one nevertheless pays only half the cost of the damage caused on the property of the injured party, then with regard to damage classified as eating and trampling, which are governed by more lenient laws, as one is completely exempt from liability for damage caused in the public domain, is it not right? Is it not all the more so that he should have to pay only half the cost of the damage caused on the property of the injured party? What's the Gemara going to do? It's going to reject this argument. The Gemara answers, the verse states, with regard to eating and trampling, the best of his field and the best of his vineyard he shall pay. The intent of the verse is to emphasize that the owner of the ox pays a proper, meaning complete, amount of payment and not half the cost of the damage. So the Gemara suggests a derivation from a different kal vachomer, and let one not be held liable at all with regard to damage classified as goring in the public domain. Why even have half damages for goring in the public domain? How does the kal vachomer work? This can be inferred via the kal vachomer inference like this. And if for damage classified as eating and trampling, for which one is liable to pay the full cost of the damage for incidents that took place on the property of the injured party, yet one is completely exempt from damage caused in the public domain, then with regard to damage classified as goring, which is governed by a more lenient law, as one is held liable for only half the cost of the damage, even when it is caused on the property of the injured party, is it not all the more so that the owner of the ox should be exempt if the goring of an innocuous ox occurs in the public domain? And Rabbi Yochanan said, the verse states in reference to an innocuous ox, and the carcass they shall also divide, to indicate that there is no difference with regard to the payment of half the cost of the damage, whether the damage occurs in a public domain or whether it occurs on private property. You can't learn out lessons about damages in the case of eating and trampling from damages in the case of goring because the Torah treats them differently. The Gemara suggests a derivation from yet another kal vachomer possibility. And let a person who inadvertently kills another person be liable to pay ransom. Whoa, what? How do we get to this? Well, this can be inferred, pay the ransom. This can be inferred via a kal vachomer inference like this. And if the owner of an ox, who is not liable to pay the 4 types of indemnity, meaning pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation, if his ox injures a person, but he is nevertheless liable to pay ransom if it killed someone, then, with regard to a person who is liable to pay the 4 types of indemnity when he directly injures another person, is it not right that he should also be liable to pay the ransom if he were to kill a person, right? The ransom that we're talking about is when my ox kills another person. Then I am liable for this ransom. This is the only area of the law where this ransom comes up as a legal type of damages. But what they're saying is, okay, well, if my ox kills this person, I'm liable for the actual loss of the person and for this ransom. But when you talk about those 4 kinds of indemnity, the pain and suffering, medical, loss of livelihood, and humiliation, those only apply when one human hurts another directly, not that the property of a person hurts another person. It's when you yourself do it, your force does it. right? So what they're saying is, well, if the ransom applies in the case of my ox where the indemnity is not owed, then all the more so it should apply when a person hurts another person where there's the more strict law that includes those indemnities. And the Gemara answers, the verse states, with regard to an ox killing a person, he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed upon him. Exodus 21:30. And the words upon him, this means upon the owner of an ox who kills a person, but not upon a person who directly kills another person. So the Gemara suggests, excuse me. The Gemara suggests the reverse derivation. And let the owner of the ox that injured a person be liable to pay the 4 types of indemnity. And this can be inferred by the Kal V'chomer inference as follows. And if a person who is not obligated to pay ransom, if he kills someone, is nevertheless liable to pay the 4 types of indemnity if he injures another, then with regard to the owner of an ox who is liable to pay ransom, is it not all the more so that he should also be liable to pay the 4 types of indemnity? And the Gemara answers, the verse states with regard to this matter, and if a man maims another, from which it can be derived that this law applies when a man harms another person, but not when his ox harms another person. Now, we just had a bunch of examples that really showed us that, logic is not the be-all, end-all of deriving halakha, of deriving Jewish law. You can make these logical Kal V'chomer inferences and draw them up and speak them in a way that makes logical sense, perfect logical sense. But that doesn't mean that Kal V'chomer is going to work, because it might violate some, deeper and more solid Torah law, as it were. And this is why we don't draw Kal V'chomer inferences, right? Kal V'chomer inferences were something that the sages did and that we learned from the sages, but we're not drawing new Kal V'chomer inferences now. Now, a dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to trampling in the case of an animal that tramples a child in the courtyard of the injured party and kills the child. So what is the law with regard to the liability of the owner of the animal to pay ransom? And the Gemara explains the different sides of the question. Do we say that this law is just as it is with regard to goring? Accordingly, just as with goring, once an animal has gored 2 or 3 times, this becomes defined as its usual manner, and therefore it is deemed forewarned, and the owner must pay ransom in the event that it kills a person by an act classified as goring. Here, too, it is not different. As with regard to the category of trampling, the owner is deemed forewarned from the start, and he must therefore pay ransom. We've already established that for the categories of eating and trampling, you don't need a prior history of the animal eating or trampling and causing damage. All animals are considered muad, forewarned, the owner forewarned, with respect to that. His animal will eat what's in front of it or trample what it walks over. So you don't need to demonstrate the history the way you do with goring. So since all animals are considered muad with respect to trampling, and now this animal trampled over a child and killed it, shouldn't we have the same kinds of damages as when you have a forewarned ox that kills someone? Or are we going to say, even though it's considered forewarned with respect to trampling, we're not going to attach this ransom concept, which is only with respect to goring, and we're not going to extend it to trampling, right? Or perhaps should we say that the law with regard to goring is more stringent, as goring requires the animal's intent to cause damage, and that is why the owner must pay ransom in the event of a death. But in the case of trampling, where there is no intent to cause damage, it's just walking, the owner would be exempt from paying ransom. So which is it? The Gemara suggests, coming here, a solution to this dilemma from a baraisa. If one brought his ox into the courtyard of a homeowner without the homeowner's permission, and it gored the homeowner, and he died, the ox is killed by stoning, and the owner of the ox is obligated to pay the full amount of the ransom, regardless of whether the animal was innocuous or forewarned. Do we think that's the majority opinion? This is the statement of Rabbi Tarfon. Right? Rabbi Tarfon says that he distinguishes between goring in the public domain and goring in the private domain. So whether it was forewarned or not, if it happened in the private domain, Rabbi Tarfon, come on! This dangerous ox went and caused severe damage on somebody's property. Lay all the damages on the owner of the ox. But the majority said no. The damages for an innocuous ox are half damages, whether in the public domain or whether in the public domain or the private domain. And for the goring ox, it's going to be, and for a goring ox, and for a muad, well, we haven't gotten to that. If we're saying it's an innocuous ox, right? So innocuous ox that gores even on the property of the victim. The rabbis are going to say, no, that's an innocuous ox, and it's going to be half damages, and therefore we're not going to levy the ransom, because the ransom only applies in the case of a muad ox, a forewarned ox. And the Gemara proceeds to clarify, from where does Rabbi Tarfon derive that with regard to an innocuous ox, the owner must also pay the full amount of the ransom? Is it not because he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, who says that the owner of an innocuous ox that killed a person pays half the ransom if the incident took place in the public domain? And he derived this ruling via a kal v'chomer inference from the laws of trampling. And if, in a case of trampling, for which one is exempted entirely from liability when it occurs in the public domain, one must nevertheless pay the full ransom if the incident took place on the property of the injured party. Then, with regard to goring, for which one must pay half the ransom when it occurs in the public domain, is it not all the more so that one should be obligated to pay the full ransom for an incident that took place on the property of the injured party, even if it was an innocuous ox? That's Rabbi Tarfon's argument. So evidently it is clear that there is a ransom payment in the case of trampling. Is that clear? Rav Shimi of Naradea said, whoa. It is possible to explain that the Tana derived his kal v'chomer inference from damage caused by trampling. And if in a case of trampling, for which one is completely exempt from liability when it happens in the public domain, one pays the full cost of the damage done on the property of the injured party. With regard to goring, for which one must pay half the ransom payment if the ox kills a person in the public domain, is it not right that one would certainly be obligated to pay the full ransom if the person was killed on his own property? According to this reasoning, there is no indication that one pays a ransom payment in the case of a child that was killed by trampling. Ransom goes with goring. Ransom does not go with trampling, even if we're making kal v'chomer inferences. And the Gemara asks, but if this is the basis for Rabbi Tarfon's opinion, let the Gemara refute it in a different way. Meaning like this: what can be learned about ransom from damage caused by trampling? These same laws apply to fire. Nevertheless, there is no obligation to pay ransom when a person is killed by fire, as was stated explicitly in a baraisa above on page 10a. Consequently, the attempt to derive a kal v'chomer inference about ransom from trampling is obviously flawed. And the Gemara answers, the kal v'chomer inference can be based on the damage to concealed articles caused by trampling on the property of the injured party. One would be exempt from damage such as this if it was caused by a fire. So the Gemara responds to this challenge with a different one. What is notable about damage to concealed articles caused by trampling? It is notable that these same laws apply to the category of the pit, but nevertheless, there is no ransom paid if a person is killed by a pit. Consequently, an attempt to derive a kal v'chomer inference about ransom from this law is obviously flawed. And the Gemara answers, the kal v'chomer inference can be based on damage caused to vessels by trampling on the property of the injured party. One would be exempt from damage of this nature if it were caused by a pit. But the Gemara rejects this argument as well. What is notable about damage caused to vessels by trampling? It is notable that these same laws apply to the category of fire. And the Gemara answers, the kal v'chomer inference can be based on damage caused to concealed vessels by trampling. In this case, one would be liable for trampling, but exempt from liability for both fire and pit. So this can be the basis for the ransom payment via the kal v'chomer inference stated by Rav Shimi of Naradea. And the Gemara rejects this as well. What is notable about damage caused to concealed vessels by trampling? It is notable in that these same laws apply to the category of man, as a person is liable for damage to these items but does not pay ransom if he inadvertently kills another person. Ransom is connected to goring, this type of ransom. We're not talking about ransoming hostages. We're talking about ransom when your animal kills a person. And he does so with malice, right? Goring is like with malice, as opposed to eating and trampling. The other categories of damages, eating and trampling by an ox, death, even death, or other kinds of damage caused by a pit. Or really, right now we're talking about death of a human being, but death caused by trampling, death caused by a pit, death caused by fire, and death caused by the hand of a person. All of these don't have ransom. Ransom is only in the case of a goring ox. And Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, so too it is reasonable to say that there is an obligation to pay ransom in a case of trampling, as if it enters your mind to say that there is no obligation to pay ransom in a case of trampling. And the Tana derived his Kal V'chomer inference from damage caused by trampling. Let the Gemara refute it in this way. What is notable about damage caused by trampling? It is notable in that the same laws apply to trampling, while there is no obligation to pay ransom in the case of trampling. In other words, it would be possible to derive the obligation to pay a full ransom where a person was killed by the goring of an innocuous ox while on the property of the victim, only if there is also an obligation to pay ransom where the person was killed by trampling. So rather, isn't it correct to conclude from it that a Kal V'chomer inference must be based on the obligation to pay ransom in a case of trampling, and therefore may be concluded that evidently there is an obligation to pay ransom in a case of trampling? And the Gemara affirms, conclude from it, that this is so. So in the end, they extended the law of ransom to trampling. Did they? Hold it. If an animal was on the property of another person, and while there it trampled the child of the owner of the property to death, the owner of the animal must pay the ransom, in accordance with the conclusion of our Gemara. And the same applies if the child was killed by an act classified as eating. The Maggid Mishna says there is no ransom payment if the child was killed by trampling or eating in the public domain, as one is liable for these primary categories of damage only when they are carried out on the property of the victim. So they finally were able to extend ransom to eating and trampling that causes death on the property of the victim. So there you go. But, I mean, you can see there's at least the connection of we're talking about an ox, whereas normally the ransom is in the case of, just an ox that gores. But we didn't extend this notion of ransom to fire and pit. Okay, at least not yet. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Now, Mishnah number 6, the final Mishnah here in chapter 2. The legal status of a person is always that of mu'ad, forewarned, right? In other words, you can't say that, well, my fist never extended from my body before this time that I hit that guy. I had no reason to expect that I would suddenly punch him in the face. It doesn't work that way. The actions of a person, he's always deemed on notice. He doesn't have to have a history of doing this. He's going to pay full damages for the direct action. Therefore, whether the damage, now this is interesting, whether the damage was unintentional or intentional, whether he was awake while he caused the damage or asleep, whether he blinded another person's eye or broke his vessels, this person must pay the full cost of the damage. It might have been an accident, but if it was my body that injured you, I'm going to be liable for the damages. Now, the Gemara infers, it teaches in the Mishnah, he blinded another person's eye. And presumably this is similar to the other example, that he broke that person's vessels. And from this it can be inferred that just as there in the case of broken vessels, yes, one must pay for the damage he caused, but he does not pay the 4 types of indemnity. So too, in a case where he blinds another person, yes, he must pay for the damage that he caused, the loss of the eye, but he doesn't pay for the pain and suffering, loss of livelihood, medical costs, and humiliation. At least if he did that while asleep or unintentionally. If it was intentional, okay, then we assess the indemnity. But if it was unintentional, we don't assess those four indemnities. Now we're on page 26b. With regard to the law that one must pay the full cost of the damage in a case where there was no intent to cause damage, the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? Chizkiah says, and similarly the school of Chizkiah taught, the verse states, Exodus 21:25, wound for wound, petza tachas patza. And this phrase is superfluous, as the Torah states elsewhere, see Leviticus 24:19, that one is liable to pay compensation when injuring another person. So this verse serves to render him liable to pay for the unintentional damage just as he pays for the intentional damage. And he pays for damage caused by accident just as he pays for damage caused willingly. Now, this is going to be derived elsewhere. This isn't actually the home address for this very important discussion, but we'll just mention in passing. So the Bible, the Torah says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Does that mean that if you accidentally blind another person, that the court is now gonna blind you? You poke somebody else's eye out, let's say by accident, or even on purpose. Is the court gonna now step in and remove your eye? It seems like that's what the Torah said, an eye for an eye. And our sages interpreted, no, that is not what the Torah means. What the Torah means is that the one who puts out the eye of another is going to be liable to make that person whole as much as possible with damages. You're going to pay the monetary value of the harm that you caused. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is we don't want to get court involved in removing people's eyes. Another is that, well, I don't know, if somebody's job is shoveling coal, right, losing one eye is a terrible, terrible thing to happen to him, but he can still make a living with one eye. If the person who loses his eye is, I don't know, an eye surgeon, let's say, like a neurosurgeon who needs two eyes because of the stereo vision that gives him, and otherwise he's not going to be able to do that delicate operation, him losing his eyes, much worse, right? If somebody loses a hand and their job is dreaming up advertising slogans, he's going to be able to continue his work. But if the one who loses a hand is a baseball pitcher, it's a very different situation. And so these are some of the reasons why an eye for an eye means monetary damages. Okay, so that's just a given here. Now, the Gemara asks, but this verse is necessary in order to indicate that one must pay compensation for pain, even in a case where he pays compensation for damage caused by the injury. So consequently, it seems that the verse cannot also be the source of the principle derived by the school of Chizkiah. And the Gemara answers, if it is so that the superfluous phrase intended to teach only that, then let the verse write, petza befatza, which indicates the same meaning. What then is meant by the superfluous word tachas in the phrase petza tachas patza? It indicates that we must derive two conclusions from it. One, that one is liable to pay for pain, even in a case where he pays compensation for damage. And two, that he is liable for unintentional damage he is as liable for unintentional damage as he is for intentional damage, and for damage caused by accident as for damage caused willingly. Rabbah says, if there was a stone lying in a person's lap, and he was unaware of it, and he got up, and the stone fell and caused damage. With regard to the damages, he is liable to pay the full cost of the damage caused by the stone. With regard to the four types of indemnity, he is exempt, right? You pay the indemnity when what you did was done intentionally. When it's by accident, you just pay the damages, but you don't pay the indemnity. With regard to Shabbos, right? So now we're going to talk about not just about damage that you did to another person for which you're liable to pay damages, but also did you violate a Torah law and become liable to bring a sin offering when the temple is standing? With regard to Shabbos, if the falling stone caused him to violate one of the prohibited categories of labor, for example, if the stone fell from a private domain out into the public domain, he is exempt. And the reason is that the Torah prohibited only planned constructive labor on Shabbos, and he did not plan to perform this labor. With regard to exile, the punishment prescribed for one who unintentionally but negligently kills another person, were this stone to kill someone, he is exempt, as the incident is deemed accidental. Right? There's a difference between negligent and unintentional and versus accidental and unintentional, right? Here, where he didn't know there was a rock on his lap and he just got up, that's not something that we would say he's negligent not to know that that rock was on his lap. Now, with regard to a Canaanite slave whose tooth was destroyed or his eye was blinded by the stone, potentially enabling the slave to earn his freedom. That a Canaanite slave whose master knocks out his tooth or blinds his eye, that slave goes free. So if his master did it by accident, right? That's the question that's being asked. What happens if you knock out your Canaanite slave's tooth or blind his eye accidentally? Not negligently, but pure accident. So this is the subject of a dispute between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis, as it is taught in the Baraisa, Tosefta 9:25. If the master was a doctor and the slave said to him, "Paint the lid of my eye in order to heal it," and the master blinded the eye during the procedure, or if the slave requested from his master, "Scrape my tooth in order to heal it," and the master accidentally knocked out the tooth while scraping it. So the slave has mocked the master, as he is emancipated due to the act of the master himself. By contrast, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says the slave is not emancipated in these cases because the verse states about the Canaanite slave will go free, Exodus 21:26, quote, "and destroy it," from which it is derived that the slave is emancipated only in a case where the master intends to destroy the eye or the tooth, but not if he intended to heal the slave. So too, in the case where a stone fell and accidentally blinded a slave's eye or knocked out his tooth, according to the rabbis, the slave goes free. But according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, he would not, because the master had no malicious intent. All of the above cases relate to situations where the individual did not know that the stone was in his lap. But if he was initially aware of the stone in his lap, but then he forgot about it and he got up and the stone fell, now we seem to be more in the realm of negligence than accident, right? So he was aware of the stone at one point, then he forgot about it, he got up and the stone fell. So with regard to damages, he is certainly liable, being that he is liable even if he was unaware of the stone. With regard to the 4 types of indemnity, here too he is exempt, as he did not intend to cause injury. With regard to exile, he is liable, as the verse states, one who unwittingly strikes a person mortally, indicating by inference that the assailant had some previous awareness. And in this case, he was in fact previously aware of the stone in his lap. The term unwittingly is employed to describe someone who possessed knowledge of the potential transgression and then forgot about it. Now, with regard to Shabbos, he is exempt, as this was not a planned constructive labor. With regard to a slave, the same dispute between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis applies. In a case where he intended to throw the stone, and he intended to throw it for a distance of only 2 cubits, but instead he threw it a distance of 4 cubits, as it went farther than he wanted it to go. So with regard to damages, he is liable. With regard to the 4 types of indemnity, he is exempt. With regard to Shabbos, he is exempt, as we require planned constructive labor as a condition for liability. With regard to exile, he is liable, as the merciful one states in the Torah, if a man lie not in wait, which serves to exclude from the death penalty a situation where one intended to throw the stone for 2 cubits, but he actually threw it for 4 cubits. He did not intend to kill, So rather, he is exiled like the manslaughterer. With regard to a slave, the same dispute between Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis applies. And if the person intended to throw the stone 4 cubits, but instead he threw it 8 cubits, is that a difference? 2 versus 4, now 4 versus 8? If he intended to throw the stone 4 cubits, but instead he threw it 8 cubits, with regard to damages, he's liable, of course. With regard to the 4 types of indemnity, exempt. With regard to Shabbos, if he said to himself when he threw the stone that he would be satisfied wherever it may land, then yes, he is liable, as he intended to throw it a distance of 4 cubits, which is the minimum necessary to violate the prohibited labor of carrying in the public domain. If he did not throw the stone aimlessly, but rather he selected a target that was 8 cubits away, then he is not liable, as he did not perform the precise planned constructive labor that he had intended. With regard to exile, the Torah states, if a man lie not in wait, which serves to exclude from the death penalty situation where one intended to throw it 4 cubits, but he actually threw it 8 cubits, as he did not intend to kill. So he is exiled. And with regard to a slave, the same dispute between Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis applies. Since the Gemara cited Rabbah's comments about various actions for which the perpetrator is liable with regard to certain matters, but exempt with regard to others, the Gemara now cites some similar rulings. And Rabbah says, if one threw a vessel, such as an earthenware jug, from a roof, and another person came along and broke it with a stick during the fall of the jug, right? So I throw a clay jug off a roof. What's going to happen when it lands? It's going to smash to bits. If before it lands on the ground, somebody comes along with a baseball bat and, just smashes it out of the air. Now, neither the guy who threw the jug nor the guy who smashed it owns the jug. Somebody else owns the jug. So these two people combined to smash the jug. The damages are owed. They definitely did intentional actions. So damages are owed to the owner of the clay jug. Who owes it? Who owes it? If the guy with the baseball bat hadn't come along, that clay jug that was thrown off the roof was definitely going to break anyway. But now that somebody did come along and smash it while it was in the air, he's the one that did the final act of smashing. So does that get the guy on the roof off the hook? And Rabbah says, if one threw a vessel, such as an earthenware jug, from a roof, and another came along and broke it with a stick while it was falling, so the one with the stick is exempt from liability. What is the reason? It is because he broke a broken vessel, meaning that once the vessel was thrown from the roof, it was clear that it would be broken upon landing, and therefore it is considered as if it were already broken, and the one who broke it while it was still in the air is not liable. And Rabbah says, if one threw a vessel from a roof and there were cushions or blankets below, so that if the vessel would land on them, it might not break, and then another came and removed the cushions or blankets, or if the individual who threw the vessel went quickly before it landed and removed the cushions or blankets himself, and as a result the vessel shattered, then the one who threw the vessel is exempt from liability, even though the vessel broke as a consequence of his actions. And what is the reason? At the time that he threw the vessel, his arrows were stopped, i.e., what he did at the time he threw the vessel, which is an act comparable to the shooting of an arrow, did not have the capacity to break the vessel because he was throwing it at a cushion. Therefore, it is not viewed as having broken the vessel. He is exempt, but one who now smashes the jug while it's flying toward the cushions, he's the one who's liable for smashing the jug, or one who removes the cushions while it's in the air, he's the one liable. And Rabbah says, if one threw a child from a roof, and another came along and impaled the child on his sword, and the child died, the question of who is liable to receive the death penalty for killing the child is dependent upon the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and the rabbis. This is a really morbid example. Clearly a hypothetical, but okay, we're going to figure out who is guilty of murder in this situation. As it is taught in a Baraisa, if 10 people beat a victim with 10 sticks, whether they did so simultaneously or sequentially, they are all exempt, because it is impossible to sequence any one of them. It is impossible to sentence any one of them to death, to the death penalty, since no one person killed the victim and there is no death penalty for partially killing a person. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira says, if they beat him sequentially, the last one to beat him is liable for the death of the victim because he brought the victim's death closer. So too, in this case, although the first one threw the child off a roof, the one to impale him on his sword was the one to hasten his death, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira, he would be liable to receive the death penalty. We're on page 27a, but we're going to keep going to finish this chapter, just a short way, about half a page. And that will set us up to do a double daf tomorrow. And I want to be 2 pages ahead because there's going to be no class on Friday or Saturday when Nina and I are at a Shabbaton with our shul. And that way, when we return on Sunday, we'll be right back on the schedule. So let's just keep going a little further. The Gemara discusses a similar scenario. If one threw a child from a roof, and a muad ox, a forewarned ox, came along and impaled the child on its horns, and the child died. The question of whether or not the owner of the ox is liable to pay ransom is dependent upon the dispute between Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, and the rabbis. As it is taught in the Baraisa, the verse, he shall give for the redemption of his life, Exodus 21:30, indicates that he must pay the value of the injured party, i.e. the one who was killed. Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, says he must pay the value of the one responsible for the damage. Since the child that was thrown off the roof had no monetary value at the time he was gored by the ox, as it was as if he was already dead, the rabbis would exempt the owner of the ox from paying ransom. According to Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, the owner of the ox must pay his own value to the family of the victim. Now, this is a terrible example in terms of it's just a morbid image to imagine. However, this area of the law, needs to be explored and spelled out because, for example, God forbid, you have a drunk driver who has his child in the car and he's driving erratically. And then you have another driver who negligently goes through a red light. And these 2 cars crash. So who's going to be liable? First of all, criminally liable, and who is going to be liable, for the wrongful death action? Is it the drunk driver who was driving erratically and already, let's say, speeding? Is it the other driver who wasn't drunk but negligently went through a red light? Are we going to split the damages between them? I mean, it's a complex situation, and what we just discussed, would be part of the analysis for that. Now, Rabbah says another law. If a man fell from a roof, and, okay, now we're getting into crazy hypotheticals. We've mentioned this once before, but the point is to test the law in these liminal areas of the law. So here we go. Rabbah says another similar law. If a man fell from a roof, and while falling, he landed on a woman such that they had intercourse, right? This is truly accidental intercourse. Somehow, a naked man fell off a roof, landed on a woman, and it not just that, he fell and she got hurt or he got hurt from the impact, but the impact created intercourse. Then what? If a man fell from a roof and while falling, he was inserted into a woman due to the force of the fall, but he did not have the intention to engage in sexual intercourse, so he is liable to pay the 4 types of indemnity. And if this woman was his Yavama waiting for him to perform levirate marriage, he has not acquired her as his wife through the act of intercourse. And this is true even though a levirate marriage is ordinarily effected through sexual intercourse, even if unintentional, i.e. if he thought that she was someone else. Nevertheless, since in this case, he did not intend to engage in intercourse at all, the levirate marriage is not affected. But since there was a forceful copulation, truly accidental from him, he didn't commit rape, right? There was no intention to commit rape. But when we said that the force of a person damaging another person results not only in damages, but in the 4 types of indemnity, did we say, wait, no, we said definitely damages, even if unintentional, but the 4 types of indemnity, why would that apply here? Didn't we say that was only unintentional? Let's keep reading. Now the Gemara explains, what are the 4 types of indemnity that this man is liable to pay? He is liable to pay for the damage, the pain, the medical costs, and the loss of livelihood. But he is not liable to pay compensation for humiliation. As we learned in a Mishna on 86a, one is not liable to pay compensation for humiliation unless he intends to humiliate the injured party. And that was certainly not the case in this situation. And Rabbah says, and let's just get the law here, even the... one who fell from a roof, this is where the law came out. One who fell from a roof due to an atypical wind and caused damage is liable to pay for the damage that he caused, but he is exempt from paying the damage for the 4 types of indemnity. If he lost his balance from a typical wind and then fell and caused damage, he is obligated to pay all types of indemnity other than humiliation, right? So it seems like the reason he's going to have to pay that woman for that accidental copulation is because he was somehow negligent in falling off the roof. Okay, and Rabbah says another similar law. If one fell from a roof, this law. If one fell from a roof due to an atypical wind such that it would not have been anticipated in advance that he would fall, and while falling he caused damage and humiliated the injured party, he is liable for the damage but exempt from paying the 4 types of indemnity, as he did not intend to fall. If he fell due to a typical wind and caused damage and humiliated the injured party while falling, he is liable to pay the 4 types of indemnity as his fall was caused by negligence, but he's nevertheless exempt from paying compensation for humiliation as he did not intend to fall. But if he tumbled while falling, so he could fall on this person in order to protect himself from the impact with the ground, then he is liable to pay compensation for humiliation as well, because although he did not intend to cause shame, he did intend to land on the person. Remember, anybody who's old enough, there was a James Bond movie, I think like in the 70s or 80s, and there was that character, Jaws, very tall guy with the metal teeth, who I think at some point he and James Bond fall out of an airplane. And they have a fight in the air for the parachute. James Bond gets the parachute. So this bad guy, Jaws, is no parachute, right? But he has his wits about him. And even as he's falling, he's able to sort of, make himself like a wing and direct his fall. And as I recall, right, he directed himself into a circus tent. And the circus tent broke his fall. And he was able to get up and walk away from it. So if a situation like that, he injured people that he fell on in the circus, right? He didn't intend to fall out of the airplane, but he did change the trajectory of his fall to save himself and land on that tent. And so if he hurt people in that tent, according to this law, he would be liable for all the damages that he caused to them, including humiliation. Now, the law is that one is exempt from paying compensation for humiliation unless he intended to strike his victim. This is as it is taught in a Baraisa. From the fact that it is stated, and she extended her hand, Deuteronomy 25:11, do I not know that she took hold of something, right? So this is this whole case where 2 guys are fighting, and one of them, has a wife who intervenes and hurts the other guy and damages him, right? So the couple, right, is going to be liable for the damage that she does to this other man. So do I not know that she took hold of something? Consequently, what is the meaning when further on in the verse it states, and she took him by his genitals? It is to teach you that one who intends to cause damage, even if he does not intend to humiliate the injured party, is nevertheless liable to pay compensation for humiliation. Once your act is deliberate, you're going to be liable for all the damages that it caused, even if you had no intention of causing humiliation, even if you just wanted to punch, you didn't care about humiliation. But if humiliation ensued from a deliberate act, you're liable for that too. And Bava says, if one placed a hot coal over another person's heart, and that person was burnt and he died, so the one who placed the hot coal is exempt because the victim should have removed the coal himself. And the one who placed it there did not need to assume that the victim might not remove it. If he placed the coal on the other person's garment and the garment was burnt, so he is liable to pay for the damage, as it is possible that the one whose garment was burnt thought to sue the one who placed the coal on his clothes for the cost of the garment, and that is why he did not bother to remove it. And he has the right to do that, right? We're not going to, bring in the death penalty where, it's like if I take my car, right, and I make it so that it moves steadily at 10 miles an hour, and there's a person standing in front of a wall, and that car is going toward him at 10 miles an hour, and he's watching the car come, right? Now, if he doesn't move, even at 10 miles an hour, that car can crush him and kill him. But he had every opportunity to move, right? So we're going to take that into account when we decide whether to apply the death penalty or not. Now, Bava said, we have learned both of these rulings through intimation in Mishnas elsewhere. With regard to the case of the coal placed over the heart, the law is, as we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Sanhedrin 76b, if one held another in a fire or in water and the victim is unable to extricate himself from there and he dies as a result, the one who attacked him is liable to receive the death penalty as a murderer, right? There's a burning house. Somebody wants to escape from the burning house and I lock the door in his face. You bet I committed murder. If I push him into fire or into water and the victim is able to extricate himself from there, but he dies anyway, then the one who attacked him is exempt from the death penalty. The case of one who places a coal on another's chest is similar to the one where he pushes the victim into the fire or the water in a situation where the victim has the ability to escape. Now, with regard to the case of one who placed a coal on the garment of another, this is as we learned in a Mishna on page 92a of this tractate. If one said to another, tear my garment or break my jug, and the person does so, the latter is liable for the damage. But if one said to another, tear my garment on the condition that you will be exempt from all liability, then he is exempt. It is therefore clear that even when one is granted permission by the owner of an item to damage it, that does not grant him an exemption from liability for the damage caused unless the exemption was stated explicitly. Consequently, in a case where the owner did not grant permission, the one who caused the damage is certainly liable. Bava raises a dilemma in summation of this discussion. If he placed a coal over the heart of another person's Canaanite slave and the slave died as a result, what is the law? Is the body of the slave comparable to the body of another person, and therefore the assailant would be exempt from liability? Or is it comparable to other property owned by the master, and therefore the assailant would be liable? Furthermore, if you say that the body of the slave is comparable to the body of an ordinary person, as the slave had the ability to remove the coal from himself, and therefore the assailant would be exempt, what is the law in the case where he placed the coal on another person's ox? After raising the dilemma, Bava resolved it. The body of the slave is comparable to the body of another person, as the slave possesses an intellect and should have the sense to remove the coal from himself, whereas the ox is comparable to another person's property. And indeed, even in ancient times, when slavery was practiced, you could be guilty of murder of a slave. It wasn't that they were removed from the category of human beings. But that's a topic for another day. With that, we conclude chapter 2. Tomorrow, God willing, we'll open chapter 3. Let me take a couple of questions on Bava Kamma 26. This hat brim does not want to stay down the Humphrey Bogart way that I like. Okay, Jonathan. With regard to the stone, I wonder where this person was sitting such that he had a stone that fell and actually hurt someone other than falling on his own feet. So he or she must be pretty high up. Therefore, it is not just the rock, but where they are in a place that's more risky than normal, as this carries more responsibility for us to take care, pay attention to where we are. 100%. Absolutely. We're not really exploring the laws of negligence yet. We're just starting to touch on them. But you right away have identified the very important nuance. We've got to take all the conditions into account when we are ascribing liability or not. Right? Was it an accident or was it negligent? Right? And the same condition, the same action, let's say by a person, could definitely be negligent in one location and not negligent in another. I mean, right? If I shout fire in my office, no one's going to be harmed by that. If I shout fire when there is no fire in a movie theater, very different situation. Sharon, while working in hand therapy, I had a patient who was a professional classical guitar player. His injury would be negligible to most. For him, it was huge. I always think of this when considering ayin tachas ayin, right? An eye for an eye, as having to be considered relative to the injured party. Perfect example. Thank you for sharing that. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for a double daf. We'll do pages 27 and 28, but we already got a good head start on page 27 today.